And Myriam is the Senior Teaching Fellow in 19th Century French Literature at Sorbonne Université. Did you hear about it? Specialising in the novels of Victor Hugo, in particular The Last Day of a Condemned Man and The Man Who Laughs, and matters relative to justice. Her most recent publication, Le droit du Poète, la justice dans l'œuvre de Victor Hugo, Press Universitaires de Saint-Etienne 2023. And that's so hot off the press, I've just been given one, so I'm quite smug about that. Oh yes, everybody should have some translations of Myriam's references into English, because she's going to read them in French. Thank you very much, Myriam. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank Dinah and Roy for their invitation and their warm welcome, and I shall try to speak English. So you will have the French quotations translated in English on the 4-page document that has been given to you. This is very well known that Victor Hugo was deeply against death penalty. The writer put forward his arguments many times in his work and in his speeches as well. It is fair to say that he was not the only one to advance with arguments in his time, for which reasons the death penalty should be nothing but an abomination. For religious reasons, God gives life, man has no right to take it. For philosophical reasons, the new judicial penalty inspired by the legacy of the Enlightenment seeks redemption for the culprits. Once dead, it's difficult to redeem oneself, don't you think? In addition, the death penalty is irreparable. Hugo happened to present the miscarriages of justice argument often used in abolitionist speeches. Finally, for pragmatic reasons, the death penalty fails scaring anyone and preventing crime. On the contrary, the public executions are put on show, fostering voyeurism, and, as a result, they give people the lust for blood and make cruelty commonplace. However, even if Victor Hugo's opposition against the death penalty is well thought out and well reasoned, we must underline that it has to do with a deep-rooted refusal, a gut rejection, so to say. No doubt that this opposition took root in what Victor witnessed as a child when traveling in Italy first and then in Spain due to the Napoleonic Wars under the First Empire. Therefore, for the very young Victor, the death penalty meant the traumatizing visions of tortured bodies in the first place, long before being a matter of debate and a subject of political and social fight. In 1807, Victor Hugo is 5 years old. He travels in Italy with his mother and brothers to go see his father Leopold, who is appointed the governor of the city of Avellino. The autumn is rainy, and the children can't get out of the coach. They keep watching outside. Quotation 1. On avait repris les diligences. Emprisonnés dans l'intérieur, les enfants se désennuyaient en faisant avec les brins de la paille qu'ils avaient sous les pieds de petites croix qu'ils collaient aux vitres. En les collant, ils voyaient, de distance en distance, les tronçons humains aux arbres de la route. C'étaient des bandits qu'on pendait pour intimider les autres. Les 3 enfants ne se rendaient pas compte de l'objection qu'ils faisaient à la peine de mort en collant devant tous ces gibets le gibet du Christ. When Victor is 10, he comes back to France with his mother and his brother Eugène. They cross Spain in rebellion, whereas the French army makes examples to scare the people. In Burgos, the children cannot help seeing the crowd in droves gathering around the scaffold. Quotation 2. En débouchant de la place, ils se croisèrent avec une confrérie de pénitents gris et noirs, portant de longs bâtons, gris et noirs aussi, qui avaient à leur extrémité supérieure des lanternes allumées. Leurs cagoules baissées avaient 2 trous à la place des yeux. Ce regard sans visage parut lugubre aux enfants. Ces spectres avaient au milieu d'eux un homme lié sur un âne, le dos tourné vers la tête de l'animal. Cet homme avait l'air hébété de terreur. Des moines lui présentaient le crucifix qu'il baisait sans le voir. Les enfants s'enfuirent avec horreur. For this conference, I would like to study Victor Hugo's struggles when he lived in Guernsey from 1855 to 1870. What did he stand up for? In which cases did he meddle? How did he intervene? I shall highlight the artistic dimension of his fights. John Charles Tapner's case is the most famous one. Victor Hugo lives in Jersey when he hears about this grim affair that happened in Guernsey. Tapner was an Englishman who murdered an old woman in St. Peter's Port. The woman was named Elizabeth Saujon, and then Tapner burned her house. At trial, it was revealed that Tapner's mistress was his wife's sister, so his sister-in-law, and that she lived with Saujon. There is a kind of mystery about Tapner's motive. From Victor Hugo's point of view, Tapner was a guilty and a criminal unfortunate. Let's see what he wrote about him. Quotation 3. Ce John Charles Tapner, espèce de gentleman, employé du gouvernement, n'avait tiré nul profit dans sa jeunesse de l'éducation qu'on avait essayé de lui donner, et était arrivé au vol et à l'assassinat par la débauche, le vin et le gin. Il était né d'une famille honnête et d'un père religieux à Woolwich en 1823. Il est mort, n'ayant pas encore 31 ans, le 10 février 1854. Il vivait avec les 2 sœurs, marié avec l'une, amant de l'autre. On the 3rd of January 1854, Tapner is found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Victor Hugo, who lived in Jersey by that time, decided to intervene and to publish a letter appealing to the people of Guernsey. This letter was published by the Chronique de Jersey and the Gazette de Jersey, French language newspapers. You will find all the details of Victor Hugo's campaign in the press, collected and commented by Dinah Bott on the Prior Library website. First of all, I would like to highlight that Hugo intervenes against the death sentence, although the convicted person is guilty, thoroughly guilty. According to Hugo, les principes ne prouvent jamais mieux leur grandeur et leur beauté que lorsqu'ils défendent ceux-là même que la pitié ne défend plus. It's quotation 4. The principles never assert their grandeur and beauty so well, save when they defend those whom even pity does not defend. What happened next? A meeting was held in Guernsey. The English State Secretary for the Interior, Lord Palmerston, was asked for pardon. The sentence was suspended 3 times, before Tapner was eventually hanged on the 10th of February 1854. But the hangman was inexperienced and Tapner died under appalling conditions. Victor Hugo was still in Jersey and he did not attend the execution. But as a response, he wrote a letter to Lord Palmerston and made it printed at once and released it separately. Impressed and shocked by this failure, Victor Hugo thought it was the result of the new friendship between England and Napoleon III. He saw the denial of pardon as the consequence of his own meddling, considering he was a political exile. Once again, Dinah Bott, in the Prior Library, gives all the details about this painful time. You can find Victor Hugo and Guernsey sparring with Palmerston, and you will find all that. The 5th of December 1855, Hugo just settled down in Guernsey and he was not yet used to its geography. Quotation 5. Je connaissais si peu les rues de la ville que tout m'y semblait labyrinthe. Nevertheless, his unsuccessful attempt to save Tapner's life and probably the feeling of guilt made Victor Hugo go on pilgrimage and visit the Guernsey prison and then the cemetery where Tapner was buried. On his way, he bought Tapner's death mask for 3 francs. In those days, in the 19th century, it was a custom to make plaster casts of the condemned, possibly for medical and criminological purposes. Explaining crime by studying facial features was expected. Those casts were also made by a sort of fetishism for death, especially regarding infamous deaths. This death mask was kept by Victor Hugo in the billiard room in Hauteville House, so everybody could see it every day. Besides, Victor Hugo made a drawing, Le Pendu, the hanged man. I will come back to this drawing later on. No one was executed in Guernsey after Tapner's execution. When in Guernsey, from October 85, Victor Hugo builds a network thanks to the letters released in newspapers in Europe and even all over the world. The banned writer used his being abroad and his fame to fight the death penalty. For him, the island of Guernsey becomes a central core, an echo chamber, from which radiates his action thanks to the word. He perfectly masters the resources offered him by the press, which is already a form of media strategy. It is a way of giving a new meaning and a new dimension to the romantic poet, whom he defined as a sonorous echo, it's quotation 6, a sonorous echo in his collection of poetry, Les Feuilles d'automne, Autumn Leaves. And Hugo, as a poet, but also in this case, Hugo, as the campaigner, presents himself as the voice that has received a call for help and, in turn, responds with a cry. The register of emotion is summoned in all its intense manifestations: protest, outrage, call for mercy. I forgot to read this quotation, this verse. Mon âme mit le voix que le Dieu que j'adore mit au centre de tout comme un écho sonore. Well, once back in France at the beginning of the Third Republic, Victor Hugo collected the intercessions he made in public life and published them in 3 volumes in chronological order. He gives them the following title: Actes et Paroles, Deeds and Words in English. In other words, what he did and what he said. He highlights the deeds, and therefore he means that words are actions. In the second volume, during the exile, take place the intercessions Hugo made during his stay in Guernsey. Here is an extract of the table of contents. Regarding the death penalty, we can distinguish, on one hand, the letters sent by Victor Hugo when intervening with the states, abolishing the death penalty. In this case, Hugo responds to requests of committees that campaign in favor of abolishing the death penalty, for example, in Geneva, in Milano, or in London. On the other hand, the interventions in specific cases and calls for pardon. Among the best-known cases during the years in Guernsey, I would mention John Brown. In America, the letter in favor of John Brown, an American abolitionist leader. John Brown was condemned after the failure of slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, just before the American Civil War. Victor Hugo's letter arrived unfortunately too late. So, Victor Hugo decided to make one of the wishes of the hanged man, le pendu, engraved by Paul Chenet, so that the drawing could be distributed. Therefore, the drawing made for the John Tapner case was distributed at the time of the John Brown case, so in 1859. 1862, second case. In Belgium, 9 people are sentenced to death in Charleroi. It happens that, in order to ask King Leopold for pardon, the Belgian press published verses falsely attributed to Victor Hugo. Far from being upset, the writer answers in a letter, quotation 7. Monsieur, aujourd'hui, un ami m'apporte plusieurs journaux contenant de fort beaux vers où est demandée la grâce de 9 condamnés à mort. Au bas de ces vers, je lis ma signature. Ces vers ne sont pas de moi. Quel que soit l'auteur de ces vers, je le remercie. Quand il s'agit de sauver des têtes, je trouve bon qu'on use de mon nom, et même qu'on en abuse. In July 1866, a man named Bradley is sentenced to death in Jersey. Victor Hugo is in Brussels. He doesn't know anything about this case, but nevertheless, he responds to a request made to him and sends a saddened letter, once more a plea against a capital punishment. I will quote only the end of the letter. It's quotation 8. J'aime Jersey, je suis navré. Publiez ma lettre si vous voulez. Tout aujourd'hui s'efforce d'étouffer la lumière. Ne nous lassons pas cependant. Et si le présent est sourd, jetons dans l'avenir, qui nous entendra, les protestations de la vérité et de l'humanité contre l'horrible nuit. Victor Hugo's letters are especially elaborate. They are the extension of the rhetoric that the writer masters so well. The rhetoric was a central component for his education in his youth. The analysis of the last two sentences of the letter we quoted is a typical example of this eloquence. The end of the letter is very much like the final conclusion of the speech that we should call the peroration. The peroration is a concluded moment with an opening and a summary calling on emotion. As often, Victor Hugo ends with an injunction to trust the future. Victor Hugo is a thinker of the future. His struggles of the current time are always linked to a better future. In this letter, he uses also a plural form, let's, like we. Victor Hugo is also a thinker of the collective, an unifying collective expanded here to truth and humanity. Finally, emotion at the end of the letter goes with a metaphor, a very simple one, built step by step, the metaphor of light and darkness, more precisely, the night, the ominous night. Victor Hugo uses very often this image, the night, and the night refers for him to everything that oppresses men. As we see, the letter, published in newspapers, is worked and well written. Does that mean that Victor Hugo considered it as a piece of literary work among others? Probably not, because it is related to specific circumstances and current events. On the contrary, as for the art forms we shall study now, the struggle against the death penalty goes with an aesthetic and poetic dimension. The meaning is not limited to a current event and is broadened to a meditation on how history goes, a meditation on the presence of evil, a meditation on expiation, and finally, a meditation on the encounter of every man with death. Let's start. Let's start with the drawing inspired by the Tapner's case, but used for John Brown. Hugo draws a series of it because there are 4 drawings of the hanged man. Victor Hugo was very fond of this version entitled Ecce Lex. It was the version he kept with him in his successive homes at Marine Terrace and then at Hauteville House. In his book dedicated to Hugo's drawings, Gérard Audinet tells us that it is probably the first time that Hugo draws a series. The choice of making a series reveals maybe the writer's obsession, an obsession that he could only get rid of by laying it out on paper. We shall, of course, notice that the hanging is shown in chiaroscuro, that the head of the condemned man is tilted and enlightened. So are his rags, through which we can see his ribs. The condemned man has no face. He could be anybody. He could be us. The framing of the picture involves a very slight low-angle view, just enough to enlighten the woods of a gallows that makes it a variant of the cross of Christ. As a matter of fact, and that is what the Latin title highlights, Ecce Lex is a variant of Ecce Homo. Ecce Homo, here is the man, expression used by Pontius Pilatus to present Jesus Christ to the crowd after the flogging, according to the Bible. By extension, in art, An ecce homo means a depiction of scourged Christ with his crown of thorns. According to Hugo, every man sentenced to death by the law is an image of the Christ, even if this man is a common criminal guilty of the most atrocious crimes. This is also what said explicitly the two testimonies of the Victor Hugo by a witness of his life that I quoted at the beginning of the conference, quotation 1 and 2. Ecce lex, here is what the law does. Any condemned man becomes a martyr, keeping playing again and again the cursed scenario of the crucifixion. Ecce homo or ecce lex is a frequent pattern in Victor Hugo's novels. I shall give two examples. In Les Misérables, the court of Arras, north of France, is about to sentence to life a poor man, Champmathieu, and send him to a labor camp just because he looks like the former convict Jean Valjean. The writer presents Champmathieu, who is flanked by two French police officers. Cet homme, c'était l'homme. This man, he was the man. Ecce homo. Second example. In L'homme qui rit, the man who laughs, Victor Hugo describes in detail the scene in which the child Gwynplaine, left alone in wintertime in the middle of a snowstorm, saw a hanged man who had been taught for the example. The gallows is depicted from the point of view of the child, too young to understand that it was a corpse, and that, what is more, that this corpse has been mummified by men to enforce the law. In 2 chapters, the narrator describes and analyzes this encounter with penal death. The title of the first chapter is The Tree of Human Invention. The title of the second one is Struggle Between Death and Night. The scene certainly takes place in a process of denunciation of barbaric and unfair justice, a justice that desecrates corpses. But it also shows the struggle between being and nothingness. Hugo's writing mixes concrete and abstract terms, and he raises the question of the limits of human language to tell the torture. I will read the quotation 9. C'était ce qui n'est plus. Être un reste, ceci échappe à la langue humaine. Ne plus exister et persister. Être dans le gouffre et dehors. Reparaître comme au-dessus de la mort, comme un submersible. Il y a une certaine quantité d'impossibles mêlés à de telles réalités. De là l'indicible. Cet être. Était-ce un être ? Ce témoin noir était un reste, et un reste terrible. Reste de quoi ? De la nature d'abord, de la société ensuite. Zéro et total. The extract keeps going on forward from a question to another, each one trying to express the incomprehensible. It's not exactly the Hamlet's questioning, but Hugo is not far from this questioning, because he deals with ontology and facing no being. The stylistic device is the oxymoron. Contradictory terms appear in conjunction. To exist no more, yet to persist. Note, and yet total. Hugo makes the hanged man be a kind of ghost, but an inverted ghost, a ghost the other way round. Because a ghost is an immaterial creature which shows the survival of the soul beyond the limits of matter. On the contrary, the tarred hanged man is a remainder of matter when the soul is gone. In this extract, the struggle against the death penalty gives way to a meditation on death. A swarm of crows falling on the gallows will save the child, hypnotized by the gibbet. They wake him up and make him move on. In Hugo's novel, the sight of a gibbet always petrifies. So does the gaze of Medusa. The last artistic expression I shall comment on is another drawing by Victor Hugo, as well known as Eke-Lex. This time, it's not about hanging, but about guillotine. And this last example will allow us to deal with the French specificity and, above all, with aspects related to the French history. Let's start with the first historical observation. The guillotine was promoted by a philanthropic physician, Dr. Guillotin, at the beginning of the French Revolution. It was seen as an improvement for a fairer justice. Thanks to a tool, the death would be instant and painless. The death was not given by the human hand any longer, but by a device, a mechanism. In addition, the punishment was the same for everyone, whereas the old regime, the monarchy before the revolution, under the old regime, so the commoners were hanged, but the aristocrats were decapitated. As surprising as it is, the guillotine brought equality before the law, and that equality had never been before the French Revolution. Well, obviously it was not a true improvement, was it? Dr. Guillotin soon regretted his invention. All the more that the terror of the revolution in 1793 made heavy political use of the guillotine. Nevertheless, when Hugo struggles against the death penalty, he also thinks of the grim guillotine in 1793 and of the French history, and this incomprehensible period when the chaos and the rebirth mingled. The drawing is called Justitia. The letters are written in red in the bottom of the picture between the cobblestones. Thrown forward, the cut-off head spilled the blood. We can see the hole of the guillotine for the head, letting light through, and the two very dark posts. The atmosphere is twilight. The drawing seems to illustrate a narrative poem written at the same time, La Révolution, the Revolution. In this poem, the story takes place in Paris at night, in a ghostly atmosphere. Victor Hugo imagines that the equestrian statues of the three kings of France, Henri IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV, get down off their pedestal and move on. The three statues reach Place de la Concorde, Concorde Square, formerly Place de la Révolution, Revolution Square, and the statues discover a guillotine from which a floating head is escaping. The poem ends with a dialogue between Henry IV, Henri IV, et Louis XVI, Louis XVI, Louis XVI, who had his head cut off at Concorde Square the 21st of January 1793. I will read the quotation then. Une tête passa dans l'ombre formidable. Cette tête était blême, il en tombait du sang. Et les trois cavaliers frémirent. Et d'où viens-tu ? Du trône. Ô roi, l'aube est terrible. Spectre, quelle est là-bas cette machine horrible ? C'est la faim, dit la tête au regard sombre et doux. Et qui donc l'a construite ? Ô mes pères, c'est vous. This poem is an indictment against monarchy and the centuries of oppression. That's how Victor Hugo presents them. The centuries of oppressions that generated the guillotine of the terror. Nevertheless, Hugo enlightens the sad and gentle gaze of King Louis XVI. History confronts men with a murky and odd fount of violence. Justice resulting of a scaffold remained a horror. Gérard Audinet tells us that the hanged man drawing and the justiciar one were first hung together at Hauteville House in the workshop, and then the two drawings were far apart at both ends of the house, Ekelex in the anteroom of the lookout and Justiciar in the billiard room. What they both, as well as the texts we have analyzed, have in common is associating the death penalty with forms of nightmare, luring the reader or the spectator into a murky meditation in which the anonymity of the tortured bodies directly challenges him. History provided the subject of the justiciar drawing. Nevertheless, the head does not look like Louis XVI. It could be anyone. It could be us. To end on a slightly happier note, and on the 21st century, I shall show you some comic strips published in France in 2013. Well, the scenario is completely far-fetched and, let's face it, a bit weak. The screenplay features Victor Hugo in Jersey, so 1853 and 54. The plot is about Hugo's dead daughter Leopoldine and table turning. But the Tapner case is one of the threads of the screenplay. Tapner is presented as handsome and innocent. He is the victim of a miscarriage of justice. At the end of the story, Hugo fails to obtain Tapner's pardon, for political reasons, that's correct. But thanks to his case, he achieves at last political stature he did not have at the beginning of the comic strip. Well, it's false, but it's in the comic strip. Because in the comic strip, Hugo is very absorbed by his grief as a father. Here are a few strips and the last pages. Alors, here you see it's Guernsey, and this is Tapner. He's very handsome. He's a poor man, he has no money, and he has a child with his sister-in-law, so he must feed the child and the woman. Well, he is caught, but he's innocent, and you see the trial in Guernsey. You can see the costumes. Yes, yeah. There are probably historical errors. You will tell. It would be very interesting. And I want to show you the last 2 pages of this comic strip and to comment this last 2 pages. Because what is interesting here, you found in the drawing everything we talked about. The crows in L'Homme qui rit, the gibbet in the hanged man drawing. So the comic strip collects pictures and subjects found in Hugo's work. You can see here on the left over Hugo drawings, over Hugo's drawing in the background, the dark urban structures, which is characteristic. I will also end my conference with these quite harmonious drawings with Hugo the campaigner, his pen and the light on the table. I hope you won't have nightmare this evening because of me and of Victor Hugo, and I would like to thank you for your kind attention.